Well, good morning, everyone. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. And today, to kind of wrap up the theme week of Latin America Labor and Migration Conditions Week, we're fortunate to have Brad Yokish joining us today for a presentation. And Brad is a professor at Ohio University, and his research interests lie at the nexus of population, environment, and development, mostly in Latin America. He is most interested in how migration and other population changes affect the environment, and in turn, how development affects population change. His research in the Ecuadorian Andes has focused on land use, cover change, and the impact of transnational migration on landscapes and livelihoods. He has recently returned from Ecuador, where he taught on a Fulbright scholarship, researching the development of family immigration from the highlands of southern Ecuador. And today's presentation is The Rise of Family Immigration, a case study of Ecuador. I would ask you to please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Brad Yokish.
All right, well, welcome. It's great to see everybody here today. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that I've done off and on for many years on Ecuadorian migration. So I'm going to kind of give a little bit of history of some of the research that I've done and trying to bring it up to the present, to the current issue of family immigration that's currently going on, kind of a big topic that's going on right now. So that's how I'm going to do it. I've been asked for questions at the end, but at the end I'd be happy to take your questions on whatever subject. Before I get going, I need to do a couple of acknowledgments to the University of Cuenca and to the Prefecture of my province in Cuenca. Last fall, I spent most of the time in Ecuador doing on a Fulbright grant, working with both the University of Cuenca, collaborating with them, but also working a little bit with the Prefecture of Azuay province in Cuenca. And before you get going, you might be wondering, how did I get involved with Ecuadorian migration? How did a farm kid from Illinois get interested in Ecuadorian migration? Well, as an undergraduate, I was very interested in agricultural issues and environmental issues, and I wanted to do my dissertation in Peru, but Peru fell into a civil war, and the language program I was working for moved to Ecuador. And so I went there. I went to Ecuador, and I went there, and I didn't know exactly what I was doing or anything, but I was kind of looking for a topic for my dissertation. And I remember going into this Casa de Cambio, this money house, and exchange house. And I had my $50 traveler's check for the week. Remember traveler's checks? I had a $50 traveler's check for the week. And in this Casa de Cambio were all these people who appeared to be peasants, who appeared to be relatively poor, many of them wearing clothes that indicated that they were from the countryside, what they call Chola Cuencana there. And they were cashing checks for $200, $500, some of them $1,000. And this kind of blew me away. And what I realized, what I came to learn very quickly, was that southern Ecuador, area around Cuenca, which I'm going to show you, was a major migrant sending zone. It had been sending, even in 1990 when I got there, sending people to the United States for quite a while. Mostly to Metro New York, but also Chicago and some to Minneapolis and a few other places as well. And I realized if I was going to understand the countryside and agricultural conditions, I had to understand international migration, because it was one of the most important social phenomena going on. In fact, a lot of the male farmers I wanted to interview were not there. They were in New York, or they were in Chicago. And so it was a very different situation for me, and I suddenly had to understand international migration in order to understand economic conditions, social conditions, and agricultural conditions in southern Ecuador. And so that's what I did, and it's sort of become a career. Now, I've done other things over my career, but I've gone back to this Ecuadorian research, Ecuadorian migration occasionally over the last 30 years. So let me get going. Okay, now I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but if you talk about international migration, it can be accessed A lot of people have different interests in it. Sociology and demography have a lot, economics, economists, political science. I'm a geographer. I'm a geographer who studies international migration. And some people study, why do people migrate? And how does it occur? Why do people come from particular places and end up going to other places? Kind of the dynamics of it. And right now, a lot of the dynamics is about illegality, about how people make money off of people who want to go one place to the other place who don't have legal permission. Other people study at the destination. How do places change? How does Youngstown change? How does Ohio change when you get immigrants? How does Columbus change when you get tens of thousands of folks from the Horn of Africa into it? Okay? But also they study how, so process of settlement, but also how migrants change. How do migrants assimilate? How do they live in a place? How do they change as a result? I study, on the other hand, it seems like origin. How does Ecuador change when people migrate? So you can study, how does southern Mexico change? So because when people leave, obviously, you've got a loss of labor, a loss of brains. I'm sure you've heard the phrase brain drain. You get people leave, but you also get typically a reception of remittances, in that people leave a particular place, but they often send money back because they usually have family members back there. So it becomes very fascinating how a place changes when you have a lot of people leave. You have money coming back in. And that's sort of what I study more than anything. The other topics are perfectly valid and interesting, but I study more the last part, especially focused on Ecuador. So this is the wow, it's important slide. This is why you should care. About 240 million people around the world are migrants living long-term in another country, which is interesting, but it's only about 2.3% of the world's population, which is a lot smaller than what you might think. Now, 2.3 million, it's still 284 million people, but over 97% of the population lives in the country where they were born. So migration it's a big deal, but it's actually not quite as common as a lot of people think it does. The United States has about 18% of that population. Out of that 284 million, the United States is numerically by far the largest destination. About 18% of all international migrants. This comes from the United Nations. All migration numbers are wrong. We know that. But this is the best. This is the best guesstimate. You just use the best guesstimate that you have and realize and just not believe it like it's the gospel. Okay. Here we go. Just in terms of immigrant countries, the United States falls in about the middle. Really, well, it's a little bit below that in terms of wealthy countries in the world. China and Japan have very, very small immigrant populations. And at the other end, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, where they have enough money to not do any manual labor, essentially, where they hire people to do everything. The United States is at about 15% or so. Not quite a historic high, but pretty close from about a century ago. Had a few more in terms of a percentage of the population, a little bit higher a century ago. But Germany and Canada have more. Australia has considerably more. So in terms of numerically, the United States is highest. But in terms of the percentage of the population, it's in the middle of the pack. Now here's one of the reasons, another big reason why we should care. This is remittance flows. These are data from the World Bank, and again, they are just best estimates. How much money goes from one country to another country, essentially sending back home. And this year, 887 billion is estimated, 887 billion. 163 billion of that to Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a tremendous amount of money that keeps a lot of people out of poverty, tremendous amount of money that has local effects, it has household effects, it has a national effect as well. So a lot of remittance, a lot of people when they migrate from one place to another, they commonly send money home to their loved ones, and it has a tremendous amount of effect in particular places. And so you can see the trajectory, even since 2016, in 8 years, more than doubled in terms of remittances and the amount of remittances to Latin America, in the Caribbean at least. Now, here is a map. This is of Central America. I'm not going to bore you with the numbers here, but one thing that I want to bring out here, Mexico now gets about $40 billion a year in remittances. That's because it has such a large population in the United States. But it's only about 3.1% of the economy because Mexico's economy is quite large. It's quite large, and it's a very diverse, very large economy. But look at El Salvador, 5.6 billion, 21% of its economy is dependent on remittances. And then in Haiti, 23% of the economy is dependent on remittances. So in a number of countries around the world that have relatively weak economies and large number of migrants, those remittances are terribly important. Okay, those are terribly important. They're keeping a lot of people out of poverty. They're actually helping the national government. That money comes in, they spend it, there's a ripple effect, they buy stuff with it, they hire people with it, they put it in the bank. So it has a ripple effect far beyond just receiving that money. So anyway, I wanted to point that out to you. And there are other countries. If you looked at Kyrgyzstan and other places in the world, you would also find something similar to that. Now today I'm going to talk more about Ecuador. For me, when I first started studying Ecuador, I used to have a different map that went all the way out to Iquitos because Ecuador claimed what is now Peru. But Ecuador is commonly divided into kind of 4 regions. The first is the Galapagos. Then this is the coastal lowlands, which has a tremendous amount of agriculture. It has the large port city of Guayaquil, a tremendous amount of bananas and a lot of agricultural exports. Then this is the Sierra, the mountains that run the spine of Ecuador, essentially. And then to the east of there is what they call the Oriente. It's the eastern part of Ecuador, the western part of the Amazon basin. Okay, this is Quito's the capital, Guayaquil is the largest city, and Quito's the capital. And then what I'm going to be talking about is this third city, Cuenca, Ecuador. The metropolitan region is probably 800 and some thousand people, roughly. It's a middle-sized city. It's an old colonial city. It's beautiful. It's a historic city. It's got a beautifully preserved downtown area, and culturally, in terms of tourism, it has really taken off in the past 10 years. But I've done a lot of research up here in Cañar province, and then Azuay is the province. So I'm going to be showing you mostly this area in the southern part of Ecuador. Now, there's 3 big sort of epochs of Ecuadorian migration in the last 70 years, in the last 70 years. The first one is in the 1980s, but there were precursors. Now, in the 1980s in Latin American development is commonly called the lost decade because there were so many economic problems. There was a banking crisis, there was an inflation crisis, there was a debt crisis, mostly a debt crisis. And in the 1980s, things were extremely difficult. And then there were a lot of, the World Bank and the IMF got in, and there were austerity measures, and they were very difficult. And a lot of people migrated because they fell into poverty, they lost a lot. But there were precursors to that. All the way back in 1964, a geographer was doing some research in southern Ecuador, and when he was walking, he would run into people who kept practicing their English with him. And he figured out that these were return migrants from Chicago. They had left Chicago for the winter season and then got home. And this was way back in 1964. But so there were all these precursors going on in the 60s and the 70s, but not big numbers. But the networks were being laid down. And then in the 1980s, when there was an economic crisis, a lot of people migrated. Now again, this wave, especially in the 1980s, overwhelmingly directed at metropolitan New York and somewhat to Chicago. There are other places, but overwhelmingly to those 2 places. Now in the late 1990s, Ecuador's economy collapsed again. There was a political crisis, went through a lot of presidents in a short amount of time. There was an economic crisis, and there was a lot of migration. Probably 500,000 people or more migrated within just a few years. Now, a lot of folks went to Spain. A lot of people went to Spain. They went as tourists, and then they stayed. And a lot of those folks are still there. So about 500,000 people probably went to Spain at that point. But a lot of people from Cañar, from southern Ecuador, from Cuenca area, a lot of those people, they still went to metropolitan New York. A few of them went to Spain, but a lot of those people went to metropolitan New York. So that was the second wave. And the third wave, or sort of the third epoch I'm going to talk about, is from 2019 to the present. Ecuador's in the middle of another epoch or another wave of migration. But this time, it's characterized by family immigration. Now, the earlier migration, like from the 1980s and before, a lot of that was undocumented. A lot of that was people migrating without legal permission, paying a coyote, borrowing money, paying a coyote, trying to get to the United States however they could. The easiest way is fly to Mexico. Fly to Mexico and then get to the border. And in the 70s and the 80s, it was easy. It wasn't dangerous and it wasn't that expensive. And there was even a fair bit of circular migration. Like the guys I was telling you about that were home from Chicago in the winter, people would do that. Every 2 years, perhaps, you would work in Chicago for 2 years and you'd go back home for a couple months or 6 months and then you go back. So it was circular migration because getting to Mexico, crossing the border, and getting to the United States wasn't that difficult. You didn't have to have paperwork. You could buy an airplane ticket in San Diego, no problem, and just fly to New York. It was pretty easy. But all that became increasingly difficult and more expensive. But most of those migrants would go as adults, young men especially. It's not surprising, but youngish men between the age of 20 and 30 migrated. But then also you started getting a lot of women who would go as well. Sometimes with their brother, sometimes with their husband, sometimes with their father who would go. But it was almost always adults. Almost always adults, and kids were a very, very small percentage of that. Since 2019, there's been this rise of family immigration, meaning that parents are going with their kids. Sometimes the kids are 17. They're not really kids, right? But a lot of them are quite young, are 2, 3, 4, 5 years of age. That didn't really occur from Ecuador until 2019, and it's ongoing right now. About a third, somewhere between a third and a half of the migration that is stopped at the U.S.-Mexico border, the Ecuadorians, but between a third and a half of them are in family units, okay? And so this was what I was studying because it was a significant change of international migration, and that was what I was studying, and I'm still working on right now. So, but Ecuador is also, it's extremely complex because Ecuador also has a lot of immigrants, especially Colombians and Venezuelans. A lot of Venezuelans who've been on the move, many of whom are trying to come to the United States. They transited through Ecuador. So Ecuador found itself with 400,000 Venezuelans, 200,000 Colombians living in the country. And so you got this big wave. And now a lot of those Venezuelans were on the move. Some of them are going to Chile, where the conditions were better, or going to Peru, or going to Brazil. And some of them have gone back through or going to Ecuador on the way to the United States. It makes it very complicated. One of my friends who worked essentially for the UN, trying to settle Ecuadorians, said it's very difficult because they don't stay. It's like you work with them on getting paperwork, getting a job, getting them hooked up with social services, and then they're gone. And so it's been she said it's been very difficult because a lot of them are on the move. So that's what I mean by transit. And so community migrants. Instead of going to Lakeside, you go to Cuenca. Cuenca has a fairly high number now of folks from the United States, a lot of them retirees, some from Canada, a few from Europe. It's a notable presence when you're in Cuenca now. You see a number of retirees there. So let me keep moving here. This is just the top destinations for Ecuadorians. Now this is out of date. It says 481,000 in 2020. That's well over 500,000 because Ecuadorian migration is quite high right now. But the United States is the #1 destination. Spain is a second destination. And then you've got a whole series. Italy has a significant number. But the United States and Spain are by far the 2 top destinations of Ecuadorian migrants. About probably 1.3 million Ecuadorians out of 19 million are overseas. Now, who's in Ecuador? Venezuela is the top number. But again, that number from 2020, it's very different now. We know that it's very different now. A few Venezuelans have gone back to Venezuela, but a number of them were on their way to Chile, were on their way to to the United States. And Colombians, that population goes back to the Civil War in Colombia. That was also a refugee population. But and then here, this is what I'm talking about here, the 28,000 folks in the United States living there. A lot of those folks are what they call amenity migrants or lifestyle migrants, retirees who live in Ecuador seasonally. Okay, now if you look at the total population of Ecuadorians in the United States, the foreign-born population is probably about 500,000. But if you ask people's ancestry, it's closer to 900,000 now. Closer to 9, and you can see that tick up since 2020 to 2022. That number's gone up considerably because right now there are a lot of Ecuadorians arriving to the United States. So now this population is overwhelmingly concentrated in metropolitan New York, overwhelmingly concentrated in Queens, some in Brooklyn, some in Bronx, some up in the collar counties, some out on Long Island. But if you go to metropolitan New York, it won't take you very long before you run into some Ecuadorians. If you go to Queens, it's basically, it looks and feels a lot like Ecuador in some places. This is, just to put it in context, 100 years ago, 130 years ago, the United States had a lot of migration from Europe, from Southern and Eastern Europe, remade Cleveland, remade Pittsburgh, remade Chicago completely. Tremendous amount of migration from Southern and Eastern Europe to the mostly to the industrial sites of the United States, right? A lot of folks from Poland and Italy and Russia, and also Germany and Ireland. But since the 1960s and 70s, you can see we've had another wave of migration. What we're living in now is a significant immigration from Asia and Latin America. So like the United States receiving immigrants obviously is not new, but the origin is different from the past, which was heavily European. Now it's heavily Asian and Latin American. And Ecuadorians are part of that group of immigrants. Okay, so this is Quito. This is an image of Quito. It's a city of 2 to 3 million people, depending on where you draw the borders. It's set in the Avenue of the Volcanoes. It's beautiful. That's Cotopaxi. There, it's about 19,000 feet and some, but it's a very large, bustling, modern city. It's a beautiful city. The place has a number of migrants out of there, obviously, but this is the capital of the city, of the country. I'm sorry. But here's Cuenca. Here's Cuenca. This is a plaza. There's a cathedral in the background, and it's, like I said, it's a very it's the third city of Ecuador. It's a colonial city. It has very tight streets. It's very easy to live. Here's a couple of images. This is taken out of my apartment on the left where I lived last year. But you can see the cobblestone streets and the beautiful colonial architecture there. The colonial center is also the business center still. It also has kind of some sprawling suburbs and gated communities outside of it as well. But if you get in a cab, it used to be even more than now. You get into a cab, and one of the first questions they would ask me is, ¿De qué parte de Nueva York viene usted? What part of New York do you come from? and I would say, south of Chicago. It's, ay, Chicago, qué lindo. Oh, okay, I've heard of Chicago. Because to them, the mental map of New York and the United States was pretty much the same thing. And so I'd tell them south of Chicago, et cetera. Now, there's a good chance that taxi was paid for by washing dishes in New York, or by doing landscaping in New York, or working in a factory in New York, or 3 or 4 different jobs at the same time. Because the joke is that Ecuadorians, when they arrive to the United States, they don't want a job. They want 3 of them. And many of them have been very willing to work a lot of those jobs to make the money. So this is, but anyway, you wouldn't have to go. You don't have to talk to very many people before you get somebody who's spent a significant time in the United States or whose family member is in the United States. So this place and metropolitan New York are intimately connected through a lot of cultural connections and financial connections and labor connections. This is just a couple of images. This on the left, this is kind of an image what's called a chola cuencana. This is essentially what a lot of folks in the countryside look like, kind of rural population that has been basically semi-subsistence farmers that farmed a lot. These were a lot of the people on the left who were some of the first migrants who were leaving in the 1970s and the 1980s. And a lot of those folks, these are the people who I saw when I was changing my $50 traveler's checks. They were the ones who had received significant amounts of money mostly from their male relatives living in the States. There's a beautiful flower garden there. Cuenca's very easy to live in. Now any idea what that is? Those are reeds. That's exactly what that is. That's what that is. Those are reeds, or paja toquilla. And what those are, Panama hats don't come from Panama. They used to be sold in Panama a lot during the building of the Panama Canal, which is where the name comes from. But a lot of them come from Ecuador. And a lot of the reeds are mostly grown on the coast. And then they're hand woven by women like this, sometimes by men. And then they're sold to people who then process them and export them to the United States and mark them up considerably. But Panama hats, when I put this up for my students, I always try to make them tell me who these people are. I think you could probably guess who most of these people are. But Panama hats were really, really important. Really, they still are important, but not nearly as important. But it was one of those economic activities that women did, kind of an off-farm economic activity. But the Panama Hat Trail led from southern Ecuador. They were exported. Guess where they went? To metropolitan New York. So some of the first connections, and this is very common in migration, there's oftentimes a business connection or a military connection that's laid down first, and then people follow that pattern, that network that's set up first. And so the Panama hats were very important because a lot of the people in the countryside were weaving these hats, and it's something that connected them to metropolitan New York because they were sold there. Some people migrated to New York legally to work in New York, selling the hats and so forth. But also by the 1950s, the Panama hat market collapsed, just utterly collapsed. People in the United States stopped wearing hats. Kennedy was the first president to not wear a hat in public. And they stopped wearing those hats, and Asia started exporting them. And then there was also a tariff change, kind of a trade deal change. And so these folks weaving the hats and exporting them suddenly didn't have a market. And that was a further impulse for some of these guys to migrate to the United States. They were sort of stuck. Their economic activity, one of their economic activities went away, but they could get a job in New York if they could just get to New York. And so that was one of the ways in which you got this connection from southern Ecuador to metropolitan New York. These are also some of the folks who migrated first. You'd say, well, they're pretty poor. Well, they're not that terribly poor, actually. This guy on the left owns some land. Those are his two sons. And within a few months, those two sons migrated to New York. Now, when I talked to them, basically they knew they had the opportunity to basically share crop with their father, try to get a construction job in Cuenca, maybe in Guayaquil, or they could join his brother. They borrowed money on informal economy, borrowed money, and they mortgaged it with his land, and migrated to the United States. At this time, they probably only borrowed about $5,000. Now it costs about $15,000 to migrate to the United States undocumented. But at the time, they probably borrowed about $5,000, get to the United States, and their number one goal once they get to the United States is to pay off that debt. Because typically that debt would come with an interest rate somewhere between 4% and 8% per month. Per month. Yeah, so you would have to pay off. You're paying hundreds of dollars just on that interest before you get into that principal. And that's why I say these guys didn't want a job; they wanted three of them, and many of them would work three of them to try to pay off that debt as quickly as possible. Because if not, he loses his land. And there are a lot of farmers in the area who lost their land. And that's one of the many social economic outcomes of it. This is just a cute picture. This is just a cute picture. You see the puppies back here? Yeah. But here's Metro New York, here's Manhattan. Even today, this is still the first landing spot of a lot of Ecuadorians right here out in Queens, out in Flushing and Corona and Jackson Heights here. There's other folks up here out in south in Brooklyn and up in the Bronx and so forth, and out over here back in New Jersey and Union City and so forth. But the metropolitan area in New York is still where you have a large number. In Metro New York, there's probably 350,000 Ecuadorians. If you counted at ancestry, it's probably more than that. This is what I'm talking about. This is Roosevelt Boulevard. If you ever get to New York, or when you get to New York, take Roosevelt Boulevard out, get on the train and get off and just walk Roosevelt Boulevard. It's utterly fascinating because it's immigrant America. Every street corner, the entire area has a different ethnicity on every street corner. It's fascinating. This is where the Mets lose a lot of games, by the way. How do they live in New York? Well, this type of facility would be pretty common. Okay, so I mean, a little overcrowded. Not great. Now, some Ecuador migrants had it extremely difficult and lived in the basement in camas calientes, what they say, camas calientes, and like you would go to work, somebody else would sleep, and then you would switch. And so you would have, maybe 7, 8 people living in a place that was fit for 3 people. But this has been fairly common. This entire apartment building was Ecuadorians. I knew some people who lived there. I mean, they were perfectly fine housing, and a lot of. Eventually, what you've had is Ecuadorians be wealthy enough to purchase something like this, and of course, who do they rent it out to? And the next wave of Ecuadorians. This is a Cuenca bar. Remember that cathedral that I showed you earlier? Well, this is a Cuenca bar and restaurant. There's a rumba total on Saturday, if you're interested, a dance on Saturday if you would like to go. But this is, of course, one of the first things that immigrant groups do is open the restaurant, and pretty soon you open the church. Oh, went too fast there. But this is another sign. This is a restaurant. This is very typical of a street scene that you would see. This is on Roosevelt Boulevard in New York. This is the kind of the pan-Latin American Ecuadorians, Peruvians, Mexicans, Colombians, all selling products in that store. Now, there used to be this enormous Ecuadorian festival that took place around the 10th of August, which is more or less an Independence Day of Ecuador. And it was enormous. All the mayors of the major cities of Ecuador would come up. This would be broadcast live in Ecuador. And this is right out in Flushing Meadow Park. And you'd have tens of thousands of Ecuadorians there. It was a fascinating place to see it. And these are some of the migrants, some of the people here. A lot of these folks are probably born in Ecuador. A fair number of them probably didn't have legal paperwork at that point either. But it was big enough. The presence in New York is big enough that you get some people like Chuck Schumer walking in the Ecuadorian parade. Even this guy, which I don't think I would have invited him, but you could even get this guy in the Ecuadorian parade, Bloomberg, the mayor, out there. I mean, mayor of New York, you can't really be anti-immigrant because that's who's doing all your labor. That's who's doing all your work and paying most of your taxes, frankly. Even when Rudy Giuliani was mayor, he was not anti-immigrant. He was actually pretty friendly, immigrant-friendly mayor. Now, Ecuador receives, in terms of billions of dollars, it's about 4% of the economy, but it's up to about $4.5 billion per year. It fluctuates on the percentage of the economy because it depends heavily on the price of oil. Ecuador is heavily dependent on oil, so what percentage of the economy it is, it all depends on the price of oil, but somewhere around $4 to $5 billion a year come back in remittances in Ecuador every year. Now, when a lot of the migrants left Ecuador, and this is still, I think it's still true to a lesser extent today, when people migrated, their plan was to earn money in the United States, to send it back to live better. So you go sacrifice, you go work in New York, you'll work in Chicago for X number of years. You save up your money so that you can live better back home. If you can save up $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, maybe even $150,000, if you can save that up, you can take that back to Ecuador and you can live a lot better. You can buy that cab. You can build a house. You can put your kids to college. You can do all these different things. You can take care of grandma. You can do all these things if you could just earn some money in New York. So the idea was you earn there para vivir mejor allá in Ecuador. And this is a sign from UNICEF that says, before you migrate, think of your kids. Because this was during an era where the adults migrated. So what do you do with your kids? What happens to the kids when you migrate? Well, a lot of them were raised by the grandparents. Or they were raised by aunts or uncles. It caused a lot of problems. Sometimes the grandparents did a perfectly great job, and sometimes they weren't quite as attentive as you'd want. Sometimes with your sister or your brother, but they weren't their kids. So it often caused a number of problems, and a lot of kids grew up without really knowing their parents, or knowing their parents only on a Zoom conversation. Now you can do it. Now it's a lot easier. But 20 or 30 years ago, you'd get a phone call. You'd get a phone call on the weekend, maybe at Christmas, maybe at certain times. And so the separation was substantial. But this was the old model. Basically, you migrate to go to the United States for a while to make some money so that your family can live better. For most of the time, the plan was you're going back. You're going to go back. You're going to live in the United States for a while, but you plan to go back. Algún día. That's a cliche. It says someday. Algún día. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a joke. It's sort of like, yeah, I'm going to go back. Algún día. I'm going to go back someday. When is algún día? When is that? When is that? Well, for many folks, it just getting longer and longer. Then if you have kids in the United States, what happens? You drop an anchor in the United States. Are you going to take those kids back to Ecuador? Maybe. Do they want to go? No. They don't know Ecuador. So it gets very difficult living transnationally, living across two different places, especially if you don't have legal documents, legal papers. Now, a lot of the folks who who planned to go back ended up staying and are still in New York. Again, that's not new. 60% of Italian immigrants went back to Italy. 120 years ago, 60% of Italian immigrants from northern Italy actually returned. A lot of people, it's not uncommon. The United States was a destination 100 years ago to go earn some money to live better back in Europe as well. And that's ongoing now with Latin America. So when migrants came to the United States and made some money, typically the first thing you would do is try to pay off the debt. Try to send that money back to pay off the debt because you had a usurious interest rate. You had a credit card debt, essentially. It's going to kill you if you don't pay it off. So you had to pay it off as quickly as you can. But then a lot of money went to basic goods and necessities. All this clothes, these Oshkosh Bagosh and these winter clothes and everything were sent back by a man to his wife and kids. Now, not all of those kids are his, but a lot of them are, and he sent them back. So a lot of that money, a lot of that remittances, a lot $4.5 billion going back, goes to basic needs, goes to put the kids in clothes, send grandma to the doctor, get the kids in school, fix up that house, all those types of things. Even for something like this. This is a church in a rural community. $8,000 was raised in Chicago, and it flipped it into that type of church. So that's fairly common, in which you get an organization in Chicago or New York, a community organization where you would try a hometown organization where you try to raise some money and send it back for some good, for some interest back home. Oh, I skipped one. This also, a lot of money went into housing. So if you grew up in this house on the left and you make some money in New York, what do? You build this house. You build this house and you buy a truck. You buy a truck. Now, how much does that house cost? It depends. It depends on the materials. It depends on the cost of labor. But that house probably costs $120,000, something like that. So not cheap, but pretty cheap by U.S. standards. But this sort of conversion from bareque, basic materials, into a modern home, has occurred throughout southern Ecuador. And this transition is very common throughout the world. When migrants make money, many of them will send money back to build a home. This guy had saved money. He was poor. I mean, his family didn't have much at all, but he worked outside of Philadelphia for many, many years. And then he sent money back, And he paid over $1,000 for this stained glass window in the church. And I talked to him about it. And, he told me it was for thanking God and for everything and to recognize God and all that and everything. I talked to him a little bit longer. He said, yeah, and my family name is on that window. And he said, we're no longer the people who clean your house. We have the house that other people clean. And his name, he was extremely proud that the Menchala name was on, that they contributed to rebuilding that church. And he put his name on that window. And so it was a status, but it was also a way of saying, my family's here too now. Even some of the homes are as large as this. This is not uncommon. That's a tremendous amount of money. Obviously, you plan to go back if you build a house like that, right? You plan to go back if you're going to build a house like that. Let me tell you very briefly this story of this guy on the left. He migrated when he was quite young. He swam across the Rio Grande when he was about 17 or 18, got to the United States okay. He had a family member in New York. He became a very good chef, very good cook, and he worked in several restaurants in New York. He was hired by a Korean restaurant. He learned how to become a chef, and he was quite good at it. And he became legal. He got his legal papers. I'm not exactly sure how, but he became legal. And he sent money back, and he told me when he first went that he was never going to take his family to the United States. He said, no, I'm never going to take them. He said, if I take them, they'll be American, and I want them to be Ecuadorian. So I'm going to leave my family here. I'm going to come back. When I make my money, I'm going to come back. That's his father, there. When I went back to Ecuador one time, I found him. He had returned back to Ecuador, and he indeed had taken his family to the United States legally. They had sponsored them legally, and they were living in New York. He owned 2 houses, one where he lived in, and the other one he rented out to Ecuadorian migrants. And I asked him, why'd you go? You said you weren't gonna take the family, and you told me all these reasons why. And he said, I tried to come back. I paid off my debt. I built a house for me and my dad. I tried to come back, and Ecuador had an economic crisis, and my dream flew away. He said, the only thing I could do for my family was take them to the United States. And so I had the option, so I did. He said, I couldn't just keep raising my family in this economy. I had the chance to take them to the States, and so that's what I did. This is the house he grew up in. This is his father. Those dogs are not pets. Those dogs are guard dogs, and I'm scared to death in that picture because they're. But this is the house that he grew up in. This is the house that his father still lived in part time. There, this is his kid. This is one of his kids who now lives in Metro New York. But this is sort of the combination of sort of what a migrant economy can look like. Here is a Nintendo, a television set, a blender, some electronic devices that the remittances have paid for. But here's next year's potato seed as well. Here's next year's that was saved for next year when they plant potatoes. So you still have this subsistence agriculture. Dad's still going to plant the subsistence potatoes for the family, but you also have this Nintendo or Game Boy and this television set and so forth there. So this is sort of these 2 worlds coming together. This is a house that he built that his sister and that basically he doesn't live in. He gave it to his sister because he lives in Metro New York. One little story that in 1973, a geographer that I was talking about earlier, David Preston, was working in the community and working in the countryside, and he took this picture of a community, 1973. Well, 20-some years later, I went to this community. I completely didn't know that he had been there before. He had researched this area, and I interviewed everybody in this community because it had become a migrant community. It was people were leaving to go to New Jersey, actually, from this community. And so I interviewed people here and everything, and he saw me present one time, and he said, I know that community you're talking about. And he gave me this slide. That's what it looked like in 1973. By 2005, that's what it looked like. Because you could see all these houses that were built by money earned in Hackensack, New York, Hackensack, New Jersey, Union City, New Jersey, Newark, and some in and you can see the new church and all these homes that were built with people planning to come back. Well, I went back there this past year, and it's essentially a ghost town. There's nobody there. There's 8 kids in school. It's gone. Why? Because everybody here has gotten legal residency in the United States. It used to be a lot of the men lived in the United States without legal permission, and sometimes the women would go and join them, and you sort of had these divided community. Money went back into the community because they planned to go back. But eventually, most everybody who migrated from this community was able to get legal residency in the United States, and they legally brought their family to the United States, and these homes, a number of these homes are abandoned. And some of them are occupied by family, by distant family members, or by relatives. But this community really is transplanted. It's in Hackensack, New Jersey now. Okay, so that's kind of the story of some of the earlier research I did and kind of this big wave of migration to the United States. I'm not talking a whole lot about the migration to Spain, but there was, but this migration to New York was heavily involved southern Ecuador. Now, more recently, this is migrant arrivals at the U.S. border. This is, I'm not sure why I don't have it here, but this is from the United States Customs and Border Protection Agency. What these are is essentially, in blue, number of arrivals excluding family units. So how many people are essentially being encountered at the U.S. border? How many people are being, now, a lot of these people who are being encountered are immediately deported. Some of them, it's a very complex mix of what's happening to people who are captured at the border or turn themselves in at the border. But this blue is a number of arrivals excluding family units, these adults, men and women who are caught. And you can see this increase, substantial increase since about 2019, 2020, and that is over 2.3 million people right there. But then in the red is, in 2024 is projected, but in the red is a number of arrivals in family units, which is a parent or a guardian with a child, okay, someone under the age of 18. And you can see that has always existed, but in 2019 it took off. And then in 2021 you can see it really grow. And so about a third of the migrants encountered at the US border now are in family units, meaning a parent with a child. Now, a lot of these folks are arriving. Some of them are trying to sneak between border crossings, across the border and surreptitiously into the United States and are detained. Some of them, especially with the kids, actually present themselves at the border crossings. Basically present themselves and say, I want to apply for asylum. And so this has been a significant change. Now, back here in the previous decade, a lot of these family arrivals were from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, and some from Mexico. But in the last 5 years, this big red wave right here is from all over Latin America. It's from Brazil, it's from Colombia, it's from Venezuela, it's from Haiti, and it's from Ecuador. And so this is pretty new for most of Latin America to migrate to the border with your kids. So my research was trying to understand, my ongoing research is trying to understand why this developed. And so if you know it's expensive and you know it's going to be dangerous to go through the Darien Gap, to go through Mexico, to get to the border, why would you do it? So that was basically, and then how do you do it? How does it do it? And so that's what I was doing on my Fulbright last year and what I'm still working on trying to answer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I found, what I think I know now. This is Ecuadorian arrivals at the U.S.-Mexico border. And so this is, in the blue are the adults, and in the orange are detained in family units. You can see prior to 2018, there were no kids. There were very, very few kids. Very few kids. 2019, something changed. That's about a fifth. 2020 is a really weird year because of the pandemic, right? It's a very weird year. But in 2021, ooh, look at that jump. 2022, depressed, but then 2023, and then this is projected through the rest of 2024 which is just through September. So you can see this trend in both the growth of migration coming to the U.S. border and this growth in family migration coming to the border. Now, a lot of the migrants who were leaving Ecuador, how do you go with kids from southern Ecuador to metropolitan New York? There's a lot of different ways to do it, and it's changing all the time. Coyotes are incredible entrepreneurs. They figure out how to move you from one place to another. There's a lot of money. There's more money in moving people than moving drugs, frankly. There's a tremendous amount of, as with the border shut, with the border tight and difficult, a lot of money is going from these folks to criminals, frankly. And that's the same thing what's happening with drugs. When it's illegal, a lot of money goes to criminals to evade the law. And so that's what's going on right now. So how do they get to metropolitan New York? There's a lot of different ways. A lot of ways in which you try to pose as a tourist in one country and go to another country. It used to be you could fly to Mexico and try to Mexico and then from there cross the border. Mexico no longer gives very many visas to Ecuadorians. It's much more difficult. So you got to look for a different route. You can't really go on ships anymore, on boats, on fishing trawlers, because it's a little too, the U.S. Coast Guard patrols that pretty heavily, and that's very dangerous and expensive. But there's lots of different ways, and many people are just going on foot. They're going for Google Map. They're going for Google Map. They're basically using their GPS in their phone, and they're going in small groups, and sometimes they're going with a coyote, sometimes they're going on their own, just in small groups. Now, are they taken advantage of? Yeah, sometimes they are. Sometimes they're absolutely taken hostage or taken prisoner, and have to pay more. But oftentimes they get through. Very commonly they get through, and oftentimes they have to pay people, pay bribes. They might be in jail for a while in Nicaragua and might get out. They have to pay another bribe or whatever to move along to get there. And a lot of these folks are passing through the Darien Gap. And this is a number of Ecuadorians passing. This is the Darien Gap passing through. Virtually no one, 20 to 21. But look at the jump, almost 30,000. Ecuadorians are the #2 group behind Venezuelans crossing through the Darien Gap. So this is 2020, and then this is 2023. Here, almost 55,000. And this year, just through January through March, it's a similar trend going through there. Yeah, the Darien Gap is dangerous. It's dangerous, but the migrants I spoke to said, it ain't nothing compared to Mexico. So northern Mexico is really where it's dangerous, where you really have organized criminals who really know what they're doing, and extortionists. So they're much more scared of northern Mexico than they are of the Darien Gap. The Darien Gap, you got to pay criminals, but you normally will get through there. You get through there, and there's a lot of, once you get through there, there's a lot of relief help. There's UNICEF and lots of different aid groups and so forth. I don't mean to belittle it or to minimize it, but northern Mexico tends to be the more dangerous spot. So these are some of the folks that I interviewed last year, talking to them about, mostly what I interviewed, though, were people whose family members had already gone to the United States, that they were in metropolitan New York, and so I interviewed family members. So this guy, for example, his son was in the United States, and he had gone to the United States, and so I talked to him about how that happened and when and why he went and so forth. And a couple of preliminary results is, first of all, why go? Why would you go? Like I said, if you know it's expensive, you know it's dangerous, you know you got to go through the Darien Gap, you know things might go from bad to worse. You might get lucky. You might get on a flight and get to Mexico and get up to the border, have no problems, and be able to cross very quickly. But that's rare. And so why go, especially if it's expensive? And commonly it's about $15,000 per person to go. But again, the market on it is incredibly. First of all, it's difficult to research because it's illegal, but it's incredibly. It changes very, very, very quickly. Sometimes it's cheaper if you bring your kid, because it's cheaper if you bring your kid. Sometimes it's more expensive if you take your kid. So I asked this question: why go? And first of all, I said there's jobs. There's jobs in the United States. That my brother's there. He's got 2 jobs. He's not unemployed. I got another friend who went to New Jersey. He got a job in Nashville building stuff right away, and he's working construction during the day and delivering pizzas at night. So nobody I know in the United States is unemployed. Everybody, and a lot of people here are underemployed. And so there's plenty of jobs, and let's be honest, the United States needs the labor, a tremendous amount of labor. Menial jobs in the United States are done by immigrants, which again is not new. Who built the canals? Who built the railroads? Who did the factory work, right? Immigrants, our ancestors. There are also family members there. A lot of the people that I showed you earlier, they're in metropolitan New York. And a lot of those people have not seen their family members, not seen their parents, have not seen their brother, have not seen their grandparents for a long, long time. Or their husband is in the United States. And so there's a lot of people, why some people are going is because they want to reunify with the family, and it's very difficult and expensive and takes a long time to do it legally. You can pay lawyers a tremendous amount of money. You can go to the U.S. Embassy or the consulate and be insulted by them and pay them money and wait and hope that it comes through. Or you can pay $15,000 and go tomorrow. And even though it's dangerous. But there are a lot of family members in the United States. Oh, and multi-generational migration. So a lot of people who migrated 20, 25 years ago, they don't have legal residency. They're living in the United States under a pretend name, or they're working under the table, so forth, or they have some other documentation in the United States working, and a lot of the family members haven't seen them for a long time. And what one family member told me is that, look, I'm going to take my kids with me because I was raised without my parents. My parents were in Spain, and my parents were in New York, and I really didn't know them. I was raised by my uncle or raised by my grandparents. I'm not going to do that to my kids. We're going to be a family. We're going to be a family poor here, or we're going to be a family economically better off in New York, but I'm not going to do that. We're not going to separate that family anymore. So to me, they're willing to take that risk to keep the family together. And so that's part of why go as a family unit. There's more fear of leaving the kids behind than the migration outcome. There's more fear of, well, if I leave here, if I migrate and leave my kids behind, I'm more scared of what's going to happen to them in Ecuador than I am if I'm with them in metropolitan New York. Some of it is, well, I was raised by the abuelos, by my grandparents, but I'm not going to leave my kids to the grandparents because I know what that was like. I ran free. My grandparents couldn't keep track of me. I was in trouble all the time. If I'm going to go to the United States, I'm going to take my kids with me. I'm not going to have anybody else raise my kids. And my parents are old. I'm not going to leave them with them. No way. There's also adolescents. Some of the parents said, look, my kids in a few years are going to be adolescents, and too easy to get in trouble. Too easy to get in trouble. I'll watch them in New York. I can't watch them here. So a lot of sort of intrafamilial dynamics help explain why people would migrate with their family members, even though the kids are young. This is a quote from a woman, an indigenous woman, 60. I asked her, why would, asking her this question about why would you migrate knowing this? Why would you take family members? Her son took kids to the United States. What she did, she took her granddaughter, her two kids, a grandson and a granddaughter, flew to Mexico legally with them, went up to the border, had a coyote, and the coyote said, walk straight ahead with those kids. She walked straight ahead with the kids, and the Border Patrol stopped them and said, well, but what's going on? She said, I'm going to turn these kids in for asylum. And they said, okay, give me your name and number, and give me your information. They said, okay, and she had the paperwork and said, here's the parents' numbers. Here are the parents' numbers. You can contact them. They're on the other side of the border. You can just call them, and they'll come and get them. And so then she went back. She went back to Ecuador. She delivered her kids essentially to the U.S. border and asked for asylum for them. The Border Patrol took the kids in, processed them, and then called the parents, and the mother was on this side of the border, came and picked them up and went to New York. And so I asked her, why would your son do that? Why would you take your kids to the border like that? And I said, weren't you scared? She said, oh, hell yes, I was scared. Terribly scared. But why? But this was her answer. Because first, I think that children want to be with their parents. Parents also miss their children because a father and a mother can only be happy if they are there. But if half the family is missing, then it's no longer the same. I went through all that. I was there for 20 years, and my children were here. And when you, for example, have lunch or have a drink or whatever, you think about your children. So you don't have a good time. Well, that's why I think people also think that the entire family is where they want them in the U.S. That is, facing everything that comes along, it's worth it to go to the U.S. And so that was her explanation as to why. She wasn't fearing crime in Ecuador. She wasn't fearing narco-trafficking violence in Ecuador at all. That just the family saw an opportunity to go to the United States and to unify the family in the United States. And that was why she said it was worthwhile. She said the pain and the suffering of being separated was greater than taking the risk to go to the U.S. Remember I showed you this earlier, that the old model was you earn there in the United States. Ganar allá para vivir mejor aquí. You earn there to live better here. That was the old model. And you think of your kids before you go. Who's going to take care of them when you leave? Now the model is you take the anchor with you. You take the anchor with you. And this is from the UNICEF saying, hey, if you're going to take your kids with you, you got to anticipate that you might end up in jail, that you might be separated, that you might not know what's going to happen to your kids. So you got to think about it. When you take your kids with you, you got to think about it. So you take the anchor with you. You take the kids with you, but you're going to live in limbo. Because when people arrive at the border, what happens to people at the border is very, very complex, and it's changing literally every day. It changes with the Biden administration, it changed with Obama, with Trump, it changed constantly, changed with every court ruling. But commonly, a lot of these folks turn themselves in at the border and ask for asylum. Now what happened was, Obama, when families showed up, Obama put them all into housing. And then some of them were released, and then some of them were deported. What Trump did was he said, we're not going to do this catch and release anymore. We're going to separate the families from the parents. We're going to put the parents in jail, and we're going to separate the kids over here. And that's what the separating the family and the kids. So they weren't going to release any of them. They weren't going to release any of the families together, and they weren't going to house them together. So he separated parents from kids. And that was the big blow up. That was the big blow up. Some 5,000 kids, 5,000 kids didn't know where the parents were. And then Biden came in and he said, and Trump actually had to backtrack. Trump had to backtrack because of the political backlash to that. And so what he started to do was to release the families into the United States with a notice to appear, an NTA, notice to appear. An NTA is a part of a removal process. You get an NTA, and it basically says you need to go to court, an immigration court, on such and such day as part of your removal process. Now, that immigration date might be in 2027. It might be next month, but it might be in 2028, it might be 2027. So you've got 3 or 4 years before you actually show up in front of that immigration judge. And then there might be delays before that occur. So in other words, if you show up at the border and you say, I want asylum, that family is not going to be detained. And if you're Ecuadorian, you're not going to be deported. You're going to be allowed into the United States under most circumstances, but with a notice to appear before a judge, and with the plan is that you will be deported later. But the process is you show up before an immigration judge, and then the judge determines whether or not you should receive asylum or not. Whether or not now, sometimes you have to prove that when you turn yourselves in, that you have a credible fear of persecution. You have a credible fear, and you shouldn't be sent back, or you should be able to come into the United States. Some cases, they were just released into the United States, and they will have a court date at some date in the future. So I say live in limbo. You got tens of thousands, right? Tens of thousands of Ecuadorians, millions of migrants who showed up at the border who are in the deportation process. They're not illegal. They are not illegal. They have turned themselves in. They're not undocumented. They're documented and they're legal in the United States, living with a court date in the future at some point. Now, a lot of them have applied for asylum. Some of them will get it. Probably most of them will not get it. It depends who's president. It depends what criteria are used for asylum. Under Obama, if you're a victim of domestic violence, you could qualify for asylum easier. If you remember, if you were fleeing a gang in El Salvador, there was a better chance that you could get asylum. Trump tried to get rid of all that stuff, all of that. Jeff Sessions and Trump tried to basically remove as many opportunities to get asylum as possible. And he'll do as much as the courts will allow him if he's reelected. Kamala's if she's president, she's going to have it tough because you've got a lot of people. You've got millions of people. 3.6 million people in a backlog, in an immigrant court backlog right now. How many of them are going to receive asylum? Under what conditions? Are any of them going to get have their status transitioned into legal permanent residency? I don't know. And part of the issue is Congress hasn't acted. Congress can't act. They can't even agree on what color red is. So they haven't been able to do anything. Even when Biden tried to do something, get tougher on immigration and deny asylum 2 months ago, Trump undermined that completely because it's a political game they were both playing. So Congress hasn't done anything. So each president is doing whatever they can and waiting for the courts to slap their hand. And so that's what's kind of what's going on right now. And this is what's happened with a lot of Ecuadorians. So you bring the anchor with you and live in the United States, but at some point you might be deported. I mean, if Trump's elected, there's a very good chance that a lot of those folks will be deported. But there's also, we have a court system, we have a legal system that might deny that or slow some of that down as well. Now, so there are problems in Ecuador, but it's not as much as the narco violence as you might suspect. Where I was, a lot of people were talking about, raising kids there, how difficult it was. There was a lot of rise of kind of petty crime going on, and so you saw signs like this in Ecuador. Like this neighborhood is the ladrón agarrado, caught. We catch a thief, we're going to burn you. Okay, this one is if you're going to be subject to our justice if we catch you, essentially. So you have a lot of neighborhood organizations. And a lot of these streets in Ecuador now are videotaped. So people have their cell phone, they'll just watch what's going on in their street. And if they catch somebody committing a crime, they will do vigilante justice because the police are part of the problem, frankly. So there's a lot of that going on. It's not so much the narco-traffic violence in Cuenca, but there's a fear of sort of a lawlessness and a kind of a lack of faith in the future. And so that has been propelling migrants to go. So this is, you see a lot of these signs up and throughout the neighborhoods and basically warning people that you're being watched and that if you try to extort us, we're coming after you. If you try to rob us, you try to threaten us, we're coming after you. And so there has been a response to that. But part of this sort of need for the vigilantism has been an incentive for people to migrate. Now, elsewhere in Ecuador, in Guayaquil, probably a lot of people have migrated because of the fear of narco-traffic violence. That is probably the case. But I think a bigger cause is that there's sort of a fear of a societal breakdown and that the policing doesn't work and that there's a fear of sort of, what's the future of my kids here? Well, if I can get them to the United States, I don't know, 2 years, they might be there 2 years, they might be 4 years. We might get lucky and they might be there 10 years. I don't know. And a lot of them are willing to say, I'll take that risk rather than stay here. And like I said, there was a backlash, what I explained earlier, there was a backlash. Trump tried to end most immigration, especially asylum at the border. He didn't want to do what he called the catch and release. And so he separated families as a way to stop that. But that produced a very strong backlash. And it led to a greater release of families into the United States. And a lot of migrants know that there's a good chance that if they show up with kids at the border, they'll be released into the United States at least for a while. So, and Biden made a lot of exceptions to Title 42, started releasing families, and then issuing a lot of parole and notice to appear summons to migrants. Now, this story is a lot more complicated because there's also the CHNV, the Venezuelans and Haitians and Nicaraguans policy, and there's a lot more nuance to it. But that's basically the outline to it. So thank you very much. I think, John, are you going to take it?
Totally unrelated to what you presented, but what is the water source for Quake?
Cajas is a mountain range immediately west of the town, and it's been well protected for many decades. Cuenca has very good clean water. They've always bragged about that.
How much of that is
dependent on the glaciers?
They're not. It's not. It's dependent on rainfall, obviously, from the Amazon. It's dependent from rainfall
Right.
from the Amazon.
They're getting a lot of natural rain.
Yeah, natural rain. It's that. There's no glaciers in Caja, in immediately west of there. So there's a break in Ecuador. Northern Ecuador is in the Avenue of the Volcanoes, and a lot of places in the countryside, including Quito, are more dependent on glaciers.
Okay.
There. But in southern Ecuador, there aren't any glaciers, really. It's not volcanically active. They're dependent on, if the Amazon doesn't produce, if those winds die down, or if the winds coming off the Amazon don't have the moisture, then Cuenca will be in trouble. But it's not from the glacier itself.
Okay. But you understand why I asked that
Yes.
question.
Oh, yeah.
But the glacier melt will cause a lot of migration in the
might.
future. Yeah.
It might. I mean, that's sort of the environmental refugee. It might. Usually, most people who suffer environmental consequences migrate locally. Most people don't migrate among things. Within the country is by far more uncommon, or they adapt in place. They try to adapt in place. Migrating internationally is not nearly as common as it's been made out to be.
We've heard that a number of months ago that Congress had agreed to some immigration reform, but Trump said no, that would give Biden a political advantage.
Right.
Can you quickly summarize what was in that reform, and maybe if there's a possibility of a new administration in the fall, if Democrats have both House and Senate, could they resurrect that particular bill?
Biden, what was in that bill was a lot of what Biden put forth in June, basically trying to do it by decree, making it if you arrive between ports of entry. There's a ports of entry, and if you arrive in between the ports of entry, you are essentially, what Biden said is you will be denied asylum. So if you try to sneak across the border and you are caught, what Biden said is you cannot apply for asylum. And that's what he was saying earlier, is basically to crack down, to make asylum more difficult, but he wanted a lot more money. He wanted money for immigration judges. He wanted money for basically the immigration infrastructure. And he wanted to make it easier to basically do immigration law, to do immigration. And I think that's what Republicans really didn't want, because it might have actually been successful. So they didn't want to spend money on that infrastructure. But what was also in that bill, and tightening down, I mean, there was a lot of tightening down on asylum. So what he came out in June was also part of the legislation that failed. So right now, what he came out in June is he said, if you go through ports of entry, try to cross the border, and you are detained, you do not have the right to apply for asylum. The courts are going to overturn that, because eventually, the courts will probably overturn that, because Trump did that, and then it got overturned. And also, if you show up at a port of entry, you need to have an appointment. You need to have an appointment to show up. So if you just show up without an appointment, you don't have the right to asylum. Now again, US law says you do. So the US law is very explicit. It doesn't matter where you're found or how you enter the United States, you have the right to apply for asylum. But Biden right now is basically saying, no, you don't. I'm giving you legal avenues. I'm giving you a way, file online, not at the border, file online in your home country or in Mexico, go on the CBP1 app and apply for it. And you'll get a date, you'll get an appointment in Laredo in 30 days, show up there. He's saying that this is why I'm different from Trump. I'm giving you more legal avenues to do it. But no longer can you just show up and apply for asylum. Because if you show up and apply for asylum without an appointment, you're going to be denied it. It's going to be overturned. Legally, it's going to, because US law is very clear. It doesn't matter how you show up. But that's what Biden is basically trying to remove the incentive. Basically saying to Ecuadorians, don't show up because you're not going to get asylum. But what do you do with the family? You can't, there's not the facilities to house them. You can't separate them. And do you try to put them on a plane back? Sure, but how many planes do you need? And Ecuador has to agree to it.
As I see the chart of family migration, I think of the children who are going to be arriving at your local public school.
Oh, yeah.
Please consider volunteering. They need your help. They need people to read books to children, to help them with their English. I was working in my post-retirement part-time job in a classroom with ELL students, English language learners. We started the year with 12 kids, 9th grade. I wanted to work in the high school because I figured these are the kids that need it the most. They want to get into the workforce, they're going to need their English. Second semester, 9 more arrived. That's a 75% increase. They need help. Your public schools need help. Or your churches can start a group to help teach English to people so that they can function in our society for as long as they are here. Thank you.
Nothing from here? Come on. Yes. I don't know. I think you need immigration reform. You need a better system, and you need, clearly the United States uses immigrant labor. I mean, you need a system where you can have more immigrants come in, quite frankly, legally. But it is an impossible, it is a very, very difficult situation, because where do you draw the line? Where do you say, well, even if the legal immigration were more liberal, where do you draw the line? There is no, where do you actually draw it? It is a very difficult situation. There is no win situation. And I do think there needs to be significant reform that Congress needs to enact. I just don't know how that's ever going to occur. I think we're so polarized that it's not going to occur. Okay, she's asking, if I had to reform, what would I suggest? I think you need more legal avenues for family unification. You need more legal avenues. We need to admit that our economy is heavily dependent on immigrant labor. We need to admit that. We need to admit that as our economy has been growing, and immigration has been growing, and crime has been going down, contrary to what the commercials say. That those things have been occurring, and that we are dependent on immigrant labor, and we need to stop acting like immigrants are a burden on us and are criminals. We need to recognize that they are significant contributors to the United States, who pay taxes, who start businesses, who do mostly good things. And we need to, instead of acting like we're doing them a major favor, we need to understand that it's a mutual relationship.
Question here.
I'm thinking that.
Are there opportunities for immigrants in other countries to work and
That's-
get employment and have more
That's a,
money?
that's a great question. Yes, and that's why Germany has 15% immigrants, and the UK. 30 years ago, Europe didn't have many immigrants, and they were mostly intra-European. Spain had, in 1995, Spain probably had 1% immigrant population, and then they've gone through a pretty radical change. Now, a lot of those in Spain, it's complex because it's both North Africans, Poles, Romanians, and a lot of folks from Latin America. But Germany has accepted migrants. The UK has accepted migrants. France has accepted a lot of migrants, and a lot of those are post-colonial relationships, like Jamaicans in Paris, like Moroccans in France, and so forth. Canada has a pretty high, as a percentage of the immigration, a percentage of the population, pretty high. Japan doesn't have any. Japan doesn't want immigrants. They want labor, but they don't want immigrants, right? They want people to come in and work because their population has been falling, but they don't want people to come in. And they're loosening that a little bit, but not a whole lot. And so you've got tremendous inequalities in the world, right? You've got some countries that are producing, where there's a lot of wealth, where even if you don't work that hard, you can get by okay. And other places in the world where it's extremely difficult to get by. And people's aspirations are higher. People don't, like those guys I showed you, they don't want to share crop with their father. They know exactly what it's like on the web. They know exactly the other people. And if they could just get to a different place, they could have they could fulfill some of their aspirations. So it's, as long as you have tremendous inequalities in the world, I think you're going to have migration. And as long as we have this idea that you can protect the state, who comes in, who doesn't go in, you're going to have political tension. Now, it's one of the tensions of globalization. We want money to be able to go wherever. My money's invested in all over the world, right? Our investments are invested. We've lowered the barriers for moving money and goods around the world. But migrants, not so much. We want to control those migrants a lot more than we want to control money, and we want to control export of goods. And so it's one of the contradictions of globalization.
About a week ago, I heard a news report that Venezuelans have emptied all their prisons and that, and told them under the stipulation that you come to the U.S. Is there truth to this? Because I just keep hearing, about drugs and violence, but I've heard now Venezuelan has emptied all their jails and prisons.
I don't believe that that's true. Now, the leader Maduro in Venezuela, he's a criminal. I got nothing good to say about him. He's a criminal. He's a violent criminal, and he needs to step aside because he lost the election. He's grown increasingly authoritarian, and so I got nothing good to say about him. But I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe that's the case. I think that sounds like right-wing rhetoric of basically trying to tarnish migrants, saying that they're criminals, which is exactly what was said in 1980 about Castro, about the Mariel boat lift. Basically, Castro's just jumping the criminals. I would need to see proof of that. Even if that were true, 95% of Venezuelans are not criminals, coming to the United States. The criminal is the one running for president. I'm sorry. The criminal is the one convicted of rape and larceny. But I wouldn't put it past Maduro. What I'm saying is I wouldn't put it past Maduro to stick it to the United States. But I don't believe it, in part because behind the scenes, there's a lot of interaction between the U.S. and Venezuela, a lot more than there used to be. And you would have to show me evidence of that, because it sounds too much like anti-immigrant rhetoric trying to tarnish migrants as criminals and trying to basically say, be careful of these migrants because a lot of them are criminals. And again, even if it were true, it would be a very, very small percentage of the population. And you got to be careful. Venezuela is full of a lot of political prisoners who are good, political prisoners who were wrongly convicted. So I would look at any of those claims very, very carefully.
Um, so I was just curious about, you were mentioning people being released with a notice to appear. Is there data on like what percentage of people do appear, and does it fluctuate depending on who's in office? Or
That's a good question. I don't know if there's very good data on that. Have you ever heard of TRAC? There's a group called TRAC out of Syracuse, and they file Freedom of Information Acts constantly with the U.S. government to try to get the data, because those data are public information, but it's very delayed. It's delayed, and they don't release everything as you would want, but they're constantly doing that. I think most people do appear, but it's far off into the distance, and there are ways you can game it. Like once you show up at the border, you have 1 year to apply for asylum. So oftentimes what they will do is wait 360 days and then apply for asylum to keep the clock going, to have longer time. Sometimes what they will do is, if you're just a guy, they can put you in jail. They can just put you in and say, no, you're going to be detained until your date comes up. Or if you're an adult, you're going to jail. It's the kids where it changes. It's the minors where it changes. But if you're just an adult, it all changes. Some of the migrants, like when one family told me that when they went to the border, the mother walked up to the border with the kids, and the guy crossed at night through. Because if he had gone up, they would have put him in jail. They would have released the kids and the mother, but they would have put him in jail and sent him back to Ecuador. So it's the kid that makes a difference. Judge can also put a very high bail. Basically, can say $10,000. And so if you don't, $10,000, are you going to stay in jail? Or if you don't pay, if you don't show up, you lose that $10,000. I do know that in the past, people just ignored it. They basically just thought it was a fine. They had to put up $5,000 as bail for the immigration court, and they just saw it as a fine and just ignored it. I don't know what percentage that is, though.
Hi, I don't know if this is so much a question as more of just a statement, but so we actually were living in Cuenca for 2 years. We just came back, and we can come up and chat with you about it later. But one thing that was interesting for the 2 years we were in Cuenca is seeing the number of American retirees, European retirees, Canadian retirees migrating to Ecuador, because the cost of living is much more affordable, the access to healthcare is easier, and just generally the quality of life, just given the climate and all of that, is just so much higher than many places in the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just curious if in your time with University of Cuenca, you actually saw that there would need to be a study for the reverse migration, for non-Ecuadorian like folks saying, we can't live in the U.S. anymore, it's unaffordable. We are going to go and have this very different life that's, just higher quality in Ecuador. So it's almost like there's a perception of migrants coming up here. If anything, folks are going down there.
Oh, yeah. Matthew Hayes. Matthew Hayes is a sociologist. His career basically is on studying you people. is basically studying what they call amenity migrants or livelihood migrants of moving to Cuenca. So he's written a lot. He's written a book called Gringolandia.
Oh, yeah.
Gringolandia is a neighborhood in Cuenca, which full of, but yes, there's a lot of that. I mean, there's a tremendous number of folks in the U.S. who have retirement insecurity, and a lot of the folks in Cuenca are not wealthy. It's not like they're going there with with $3 million in the bank. A lot of them are living off a pension or living off of Social Security and are pinching pennies. And so, yeah, Panama, see, there's sort of this wave. It was Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, and then Ecuador in the last 10 years. But this is going on elsewhere in the world as well. Some folks from China is going to Thailand and so forth. But yeah, basically it's called livelihood migration or amenity migrants, sometimes retirement migration, in which you get folks going to elsewhere in the world where the cost of living is cheaper, where there's no real winter, and where it's nice, and crime rate is lower. It's a good life in Cuenca. It's a good life in Cuenca, and now it's got a lot of amenities. It's not really much of a struggle anymore. 30 years ago, the poverty was much higher. Electricity might work, might not work, but a lot of that is a lot better. But there's a lot of research on basically this sort of disproportionate power of folks coming, refusing to speak Spanish, and wanting everything to be like it was in Lincoln, Nebraska, and are wondering, So and this has really happened in Panama, where you had more money, and basically gringos throwing their weight around, trying to change the place for what they wanted, and a lot of tensions around trash and dogs. But there's a fair bit of research on that, and trying to find ways of making that migration mutually beneficial as well. And it starts with learning Spanish.
Thank you very much, Brad.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.